Lesson 46, the perfect and pluperfect subjunctive, review of the subjunctive, cum, denoting time. Hi everybody, welcome back to Lenny's Latin class. Today we're at the bottom of page 137 on lesson 46. In case you're wondering, lesson 45 was merely a review lesson, so there was no need for me to record that because it only consists of exercises from previous lessons. So there's no new material in that, and if you want to examine that material again, you can simply go back and listen to the lecture again that it originally came from. So again, today we are in lesson 46, and we're going to talk mainly about the subjunctive. In Latin, verbs can have several moods. And I don't mean like being in a good mood or a bad mood. By mood, I mean different kinds of expressiveness by which verbs can express different shades of meaning. And each mood has a name. We have the indicative mood. It's called the indicative mood because it indicates things. It just tells you real things, real activity. We have the imperative mood. That's called the imperative mood because you're giving a command. That's from the Latin verb impero, which means to issue a command. Some grammarians refer to the infinitive as a mood. Some don't. But then we have the subject of today's lecture, which is the subjunctive. And the name subjunctive, the subjunctive mood, the actual name subjunctive, literally means to join under. Sub, S-U-B, means under or at the foot of in Latin. And the J-U-N-C-T root word comes from the verb jungo, which means to join. Jungo, jungere, junxi, junctum. We have English words like junction, conjunction, even words like juxtaposition, I believe, are related to jungo. So jungo has to do with joining things. And according to what I've been told, ancient Roman grammarians did not call the subjunctive the subjunctive. They called it the conjunctive. And the word conjunctive means to join together. So whether you call it subjunctive or conjunctive, either way, the idea is that you're joining or linking two things together. And so the reason they call it that name, that is subjunctive, literally to join under, is that it's commonly seen in subordinate clauses. You know, in Latin, you have a main clause, and then often you'll have an independent clause or a subordinate clause within that. You know, the main clause can stand by itself. It's an independent clause, but a subordinate clause cannot stand by itself. For example, if I say, because I wanted coffee, I went to the coffee shop. Okay, so the main clause is I went to the coffee shop, and then because I wanted coffee, that's a subordinate clause. The main clause is independent. I could say, I went to the coffee shop, and that forms a complete sentence all by itself. But if I say, because I wanted coffee, that is not a complete sentence. It is not an independent clause that can stand on its own. It's a dependent clause or subordinate clause. And even the word subordinate gives us a clue. Sub, again, sub means under. And then ordo, O-R-D-O, ordo in Latin, means order or rank or row. So the word subordinate means that it's ordered or ranked below something. And that's really what's happening with a subordinate clause. You have the main clause, and then you have another clause that is somehow under that in the sense of being subordinate to it. So that's why we see the word sub in words like subordinate and subjunctive, because they're in these clauses that are working, in a sense, under the main clause in the sentence. It's a subordinate or dependent clause. So that's a little bit about where the name comes from. Now let's talk for a moment about the nature of the subjunctive. What does it do? Basically, the way most Latin teachers explain it is that the indicative mood in Latin describes action that is real or is supposed to be real, whereas the subjunctive mood talks about action that is not real. And what do I mean when I say it's not real? What I mean is that it's action that is wished for, action that is possible, action that is contingent on something else happening. If this happens, then that will happen. You're not talking about actual activity that's going on. You're just talking about something that could happen if the circumstances are right. So if I say, I am going to the coffee shop, that's just a simple declarative sentence with an indicative verb. It's action that is real in the sense that it's intended to take place in reality. But if I say, I might go to the coffee shop today, that is activity that doesn't have any real action associated with it right now. It's not that I'm going to the coffee shop. I'm just daydreaming about it or thinking about it. So in that sense, it's not real action. It's just action that's thought about, conceived of, wished for, hoped for. Okay, so the subjunctive, in a general sense, is talking about action that is not real. And in Latin, we have different ways to deploy the subjunctive. One way to do it is with a hortatory subjunctive. If I say to my friends, if I'm having a party at my house and I say to my guests, let us now go into the living room. That's a hortatory subjunctive. Hortor means encourage. I believe you learned that particular verb in Latin a couple of lessons ago in lesson 44. Hortor means to encourage. So a hortatory subjunctive is a subjunctive that encourages or urges someone to do something. It's considered a polite way to give a command. If I say to my guests at the party, go into the living room, that's not a very polite way to say it. That's using the imperative. I'm actually commanding them or ordering them to go. But a more polite way to say it, a more gentle way to say it, is to use a hortatory subjunctive. Let us go into the living room. If that were in Latin, you would use a subjunctive verb to communicate that. You would have a first-person plural verb, but it would be in the subjunctive mood. Let us go into the living room. Another way is to wish something for someone. If I go into the king's chamber and I say, O king, may you live and reign for many, many years. Well, that's activity that I'm wishing for. I'm saying, may you live for many years. It's not real action. It hasn't happened yet. You don't know if it's going to happen. It's just simply action that's wished for or hoped for. A purpose clause is yet another example of the subjunctive, how we can deploy it in Latin. If I say, I am going to the store in order to buy some bread, or I'm going to the store so that I might buy some bread. In Latin, if you said that in Latin, the part about so that I might buy bread, that part of the sentence would be in the subjunctive. It's not real action in the sense that someone's doing it yet. It's action that's planned out, or you're explaining why you might do something or will do something. Conditions are another big use of the subjunctive. If I say a condition like, if you ever go to the coffee shop, I'll go with you. Statements like that have if, those can have a subjunctive verb. Again, those are called conditionals. And if you say if something happens, that's not real action. That's just action that's being talked about, thought about, planned for. No one's actually done it yet. No one's doing it. No one is definitely going to do it. There's a certain indefiniteness that's associated with it in the sense that it's not real action. So again, the subjunctive mood is associated with action that is not real in that sense. In the past, I've seen an interesting question about future tense verbs. The question was, why do future tense verbs in Latin not have a subjunctive mood available? You can't have a future subjunctive. Why is that? And the way it's been explained to me is that If you think about it, the subjunctive mood, as I mentioned already, is associated with action that is not real, wished for, hoped for, things like that. And in a sense, all future verbs are like that. Whenever you say anything in the future tense, it hasn't happened yet. So when you think about it, there is a sense of uncertainty associated with the future tense. And so the way it's been explained to me is that the future tense is already uncertain, so it doesn't need to have even more uncertainty by having a future subjunctive, because it's already got a certain unrealness or uncertainty to it. The only tenses I know of in Latin that can have a subjunctive form would be the present tense. You can have a present subjunctive. You can have an imperfect subjunctive. You can have a pluperfect subjunctive. You can have a perfect tense subjunctive. But to my knowledge, there's no such thing as a future tense subjunctive. Now keep in mind, with periphrastic verbs, that is, verbs that include a participle and a verb of being, those kinds of verbs can have lots of different things done to them. So it is possible to have, say, for example, a future participle with a subjunctive verb of being attached to it. So you can do things like that. What I'm referring to is just the straight future tense. Ambulabo, ambulabis, I will walk, you will walk. You can't take that and turn it into a future tense subjunctive. It doesn't exist. But in the present tense, ambulas, you walk, I can turn that immediately into a subjunctive by changing the A to an E, ambules. So no future tense subjunctives, but we do have them in the present, perfect, imperfect, and pluperfect. And again, the reason is because the future is inherently already uncertain. Okay, so that was a quick review of the subjunctive. Now let's take a look at some of the specific things they want to tell us in this particular lesson, and let's start with section 366. So in past lessons, they've taught us how to make the imperfect subjunctive, the present tense subjunctive. In this particular lesson, they're going to show us additional tenses for the subjunctive. They're going to show us here how to form the perfect subjunctive and how to form the pluperfect subjunctive. So this is one of the two big new things that we're learning in this lesson. And what we'll do is we'll take, as they say here in section 366, we're going to take the perfect stem and we're going to add things to that. So what's the perfect stem? Let's think about the verb laudo. For laudo, we have laudo, laudare, laudavi. Okay, so laudavi is the perfect tense, first person singular, I praised. If we take away the letter I from the end, we get laudav. So that is the perfect stem. And we're going to add things to it. To make the perfect subjunctive, we're going to add eri plus personal endings. To get the pluperfect subjunctive, we're going to add isse to the perfect stem plus personal endings. So the recipe for a perfect subjunctive is perfect stem, eri, and then personal endings. The recipe for a pluperfect subjunctive is perfect stem, isse, and then personal endings. That's how we add up things to make those forms. So let's take a look at the next page. That's page 138. And they have a paradigm here. That is a chart. So to form the first person singular of the perfect subjunctive for laudo, we take laudav, that's the perfect stem. We add eri, and then we'll add the letter m. So laudavirim is the perfect subjunctive, first person singular. Second person singular, same thing. We get the perfect stem, we add eri, and then we add the personal ending, which is the letter s. So laudaviris. You may have noticed by now that these forms look just like the future perfect. As far as spelling goes, they look just alike. The only difference is that you may find a difference in the macrons. In fact, in some charts, the second person singular here, laudaveris, will actually have a macron over that final I that comes next to last in the word. I don't know why it's not here. So it would sound something like laudaveris, with a long I there. But if you're using a text that does not have macrons, there will be no way to tell the difference between many of these forms and many of the future perfects, because they'll be spelled the same. So if you're reading a text without macrons and you see the word laudaveris, it could be a future perfect. It could be saying, you will have praised, or it could be perfect subjunctive as part of some kind of condition or subordinate clause or something. So my basic point here is perfect subjunctives, generally speaking, not every time, but generally speaking, they look just like future perfects, except for macrons. In the first person singular, you'll see an M here in the perfect subjunctive, but the letter O for the future perfect. So anyway, what's happening here, again, is we take the perfect stem, L-A-U-D-A-V, we add ERI, and then personal endings. That's the recipe for a perfect subjunctive. Moving over to the right column, we see pluperfect subjunctive. Here we'll be adding ISSE to the perfect stem. For laudo, the perfect stem, again, is L-A-U-D-A-V. We add ISSE, and then we add personal endings. So that gives us laudavissim. We have the perfect stem, ISSE, and then the letter M for the first person singular ending, laudavises for the second person singular form, and so on and so forth. Pluperfect subjunctives are not hard to spot because they don't look like anything else. If you see laudavisse, that's a perfect tense infinitive, but if it's got an ending on it, then it's pluperfect subjunctive. So those really are not hard to spot. Let's take a look at a couple of other conjugations. We have, in the bottom part of this chart, monuerim. That's the verb moneo. Take the third principal part, monui, remove the I, and that gives you the perfect stem, M-O-N-U. So M-O-N-U is the perfect stem. We add E-R-I. That gives us monueri. Then we add the letter M, monuerim. So again, the recipe is the same. You're just taking the perfect stem, adding ERI plus endings. Same for rexerim. That's the verb rego, regere, rexi. So R-E-X is the perfect stem. Add ERI, add a personal ending, and voila, you have the perfect subjunctive. For pluperfect subjunctive, for moneo, move over to the right column. M-O-N-U, monu, is the perfect stem. Add I-S-S-E, add a personal ending, and you get monuissim. A quick note about accents here. What syllable the accent goes on is what I mean. Notice that for the perfect subjunctive first person singular, we have laudaverim with the accent on the antepenult. Why is that? Because the next to last syllable, known as the penult, does not have a long vowel. The E there is short, and it's not a closed syllable. It's an open syllable. So the accent goes back to the antepenult. So we get laudaverim. Moving over to the right column, we have the pluperfect subjunctive. Notice that the penult there is a closed syllable. We have two S's in a row. So the final syllable, also known as the ultima, is S-E-M. The next to last syllable, also known as the penult, is V-I-S. Okay, V-I-S, that syllable ends with a consonant. So that is a closed syllable. Even though the vowel there is short, the syllable is still going to get the accent because it's a closed syllable. So this will not sound like laudavissim. It sounds like laudavissim. If it's a closed syllable, it's going to be treated as if it were a long syllable, even if the vowel contained in the syllable is short in length. Notice also below this chart, they mention some vowel contractions that can occur. In a nutshell, the letters V and E can get chopped out. So instead of laudaverem, you can chop out the V and the E and just have laudarim. Likewise, for laudaverit, the V and the E can get chopped out, and instead you just get laudarit. So keep in mind that for many of these verbs, the V and the E can go away, giving you these contracted forms, such as laudarim, laudarit. So you just have to be aware of those. Keep your eyes peeled for them. Let's move on to section 367, and let's talk about the passive forms of these subjunctive verbs. The perfect tense passive subjunctive is really not hard because you already know that in the perfect tense, it's a periphrastic tense. You have a participle plus a verb of being. For example, if I wanted to say, I was praised in the perfect tense, I would say, laudatus sum. If I were a female, I would say, laudata sum. If I were a neuter entity, like a town, I would say, laudatum sum. I was praised. So those are gendered verb forms with gendered participles that match the gender of the subject. And so what you do is you just take the verb of being and you make it subjunctive. So instead of laudatus sum, it becomes laudatus sim. If I want to say you were praised and you are a male, I would say laudatus s. But if I want to make it subjunctive, I would say laudatus sis. So sim, sis, sit, the subjunctive forms of sum. For pluperfect subjunctive passive, you do kind of the same thing. You get the perfect passive participle, but then you add the imperfect subjunctive to that. So sm, ss, those pluperfect subjunctive forms of sum, you add that to the perfect passive participle, and you get things like laudatus sm. So that's the recipe for a pluperfect passive subjunctive. So for both of these passives here, you're just taking the perfect passive participle, gendered according to the gender of the subject, and then you make the verb of being subjunctive. That's the short version of how you form these things. Moving on to section 368, they have a review of subjunctive endings. Notice that in the first person singular, we don't have the letter O, we get the letter M. So for laudo, if you want to say, I praise, but you want to put it in the subjunctive, you'd say laudim. If you want to say, I was praising, but in the subjunctive, you'd say laudarim, and so on and so forth. The letter M there is the first person singular ending. Laudavissim for pluperfect subjunctive. If you want to say, I am being praised, that's laudor. But if you want to put it in the subjunctive, it becomes lauder, L-A-U-D-E-R. And you can see that represented in the right column here under passive. For the other conjugations besides the first conjugation, you'll have the letter A there. I don't really have a good way to suddenly just make you familiar with all these forms. There's a lot here to know. What I would definitely say, though, is if you try to internalize some of this meaning and some of these speech patterns by speaking the language, I think that's extremely helpful. Getting accustomed to morphology and getting accustomed to new vocabulary, those two areas are two areas where speaking Latin for practice really excels as far as kind of supercharging the learning experience. Speaking the language and listening to others speak it, it adds sort of a experiential dimension to learning these forms. It takes you beyond just merely memorizing charts and it takes you into a place where you're actually using some of these words and forms to actually express meaning. And when you hear someone else use a form like that, you have to figure out what they're saying and what it implies about what they are intending to say, that is, what they are expressing. So instead of merely just chart memorization, and I'm not knocking that, there is a time and a place to do some rote memorization and just try to get familiar with, a language. But going beyond that, also, if you practice using the forms to actually say things, that can add a really effective dimension of practice to your learning experience. And that can really enhance your learning. It can make you learn the stuff better and faster too. So yes, memorize the forms, get familiar with the forms, write them out, blah, 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 do all that. But also try to say things in the language in such a way where you know what you're trying to express with these different forms. And that will really enhance your learning. Times like this are when speaking Latin as a learning technique really shines. Speak Latin for practice. That's my mantra. And it's my mantra because it is of such high value to the learner. It's really an effective learning technique. So don't miss out. Speak Latin. Moving on to 369 and 370, let's take a quick look at 370 and review cum clauses. We talked about this some in lesson 44, but we need to talk about it again. And for those of you who are taking notes in a notebook, this subject we're talking about is cum clauses. Okay, we have 4 kinds of cum clauses. One of them takes an indicative. The other 3 take the subjunctive. So if you're taking notes, you could have on the left side of your notes, cum plus the indicative. And then over on the right, you could say cum plus the subjunctive. And there are 3 different kinds of cum plus subjunctive statements. Cum plus the indicative, we call that a cum temporal because we translate cum as when. And as the name suggests, temporal is just indicating time. So you're saying when something happened. And it's just talking about time. There's no sense that what happened is somehow connected to the rest of the sentence. You're just talking about time. But if you say cum plus the subjunctive, now you're talking about circumstances under which the rest of the sentence happened. In section 370, they're saying cum, meaning when, with the imperfect or pluperfect, takes the subjunctive to describe the circumstances under which something occurs. So this is an example of how traditionally they tell you that cum plus the subjunctive can mean when, since, or although. When, since, or although. That's what my Latin teacher in high school used to tell me. When you have cum, meaning when, we call that a cum circumstantial. When you have cum, meaning since, we call that a cum causal clause. When you have cum, meaning although, we call that a cum concessive clause. So cum plus the indicative, we call that a cum temporal. Cum plus the subjunctive, when it means when, we call that a cum circumstantial. Cum plus the subjunctive, when it means since, we call that a cum causal clause. And when it's cum plus the subjunctive and cum means although, we call that a cum concessive clause. So that's the way it's traditionally taught. And that's what we see here in section 370. They say cum, meaning when. But if you'll notice here, when they say cum, meaning when, it doesn't really refer to time. It refers to, as they say here, the circumstances under which something occurs. So when really isn't even the best way to do that. It's really better to say, instead of when, since, or although, when you're talking about cum plus the subjunctive, instead of when, since, or although, it's really better to say under the circumstances that, since, or although. So instead of when, think of under the circumstances that. And that really gives you more of an accurate meaning of, or an accurate translation of what that kind of clause is communicating. It's more clear and accurate to say under the circumstances that than it is to say when. So take what you're reading here in section 370, take it with a grain of salt. This is more of an older way to describe it. So at times like this, with a cum circumstantial, you have the word cum plus a subjunctive verb. If it's the kind of clause that's telling us about circumstances, we're not going to translate it as when, as it says here, as it instructs us to do here in section 370. Instead, we will translate it as under the circumstances that. With all that having been said, ablative absolute there, let's look at section 369 and look at our model sentences. And again, here in the paragraph underneath the model sentences, again, they're telling us that the cum circumstantial is talking about the circumstances under which things happen. So again, we're going to say under the circumstances which, not when, as they do in the translations for the model sentences. Okay, so let's take a look at these model sentences in section 369. The first one says, cum esset Caesar in ceteriore Gallia, belgas contra populum Romanum coniurare cognovit. So our main clause here is belgas contra populum Romanum coniurare cognovit. That's the main clause, and then we have a subordinate clause, cum esset Caesar in ceteriore Gallia. Okay, a main clause and a subordinate clause. Let's work on the main clause first. So the main verb here in our main clause is cognovit. That's the verb cognosco, which means to learn. And cognovit is perfect tense, third person singular. So it means he, she, or it learned. The he is referring to Caesar. So he learned. And then we have a big fat noun clause going from belgas to coniurare. Really, it's indirect speech. It's an indirect statement with belgas as the accusative subject and coniurare as the infinitive verb in the indirect statement. Belgas is Belgians, and coniurare is the verb conjuro that means to conspire. So what we have so far says, he learned that the Belgians were conspiring. Coniurare is a present tense infinitive. Remember that in indirect speech, the tense of the action is relative to the main verb. So the main verb here, cognovit, is in the past. Coniurare is a present tense infinitive, so that's going to be in the same tense as the main verb. So we'll put coniurare, the action being described by that verb, we'll put that in the past too. So we'll say something like were conspiring to make it sound like it's in the past. So he learned that the Belgians were conspiring. Contra populum Romanum means against the Roman people. That's pretty easy. Okay, so this is a classic case of indirect speech, starting with a verb of thinking, feeling, saying, a verb of the head or heart, as they say. So he learned, and then we throw in the word that, and then we get belgas coniurare. He learned that the Belgians were conspiring against the Roman people. That's the main clause. But in the first part of the sentence, we have a cum clause with cum plus the subjunctive. In this particular lesson, they are guiding us to look at cum circumstantial clauses, and they want us to translate it as when. I'm trying to nudge you more toward translating it as under the circumstances that. So let's see how that plays out here. In the cum clause here, the subject is Caesar, and the verb is esset. So Caesar was, and then in ceteriore Gallia, that means in nearer Gaul. Ceterior means nearer. CIS, that preposition kiss, CIS, it means on this side of. So keteriore is basically a comparative related to that. So it's like Gaul that's on this side, it's not just on this side, it's on this side, It's kind of what it's saying. So nearer Gaul, here they have more of an archaic translation, hither Gaul. So how will we translate cum at the beginning of this clause? Will we translate it as when or under the circumstances that? Let's try it both ways. When Caesar was in nearer Gaul, he learned that the Belgians were conspiring, blah, blah, blah. Okay, that's one way. Or under the circumstances that Caesar was in nearer Gaul, he learned that the Belgians were conspiring, blah, blah, blah. So this is definitely classified as a cum circumstantial clause. Okay, cum plus the subjunctive. You have three possibilities: cum circumstantial, cum causal, and cum concessive. Just for practice, let's try it the wrong ways and see how wrong it sounds. Let's pretend like it's a cum causal clause and see what would happen. We'll translate cum as since or because. Since Caesar was in nearer Gaul, he learned that the Belgians were conspiring. That kind of sort of makes sense, but it's not really the best way to do it, because that's not really what it's saying. Let's try it as a concessive clause, translating cum as although. Although Caesar was in nearer Gaul, he learned that the Belgians were conspiring. So that clearly doesn't make any sense, because there's nothing about Caesar being in nearer Gaul that would make it harder for him to learn about the Belgians. There's nothing working against him. There's no circumstance that would lead us to have to say although. Like, in spite of the fact that this difficult thing was going on, still he learned about the Belgians. It's not saying that at all. So treating it as a cum concessive, with cum meaning although, that obviously doesn't work. Other times, you will see that kind of thing, but in this case, just for practice, I'm showing you that that's not what this is saying. And again, with a cum causal, if we say since Caesar was in Gaul, that doesn't really make much sense either. It doesn't really communicate what the sentence is saying. But what does work is treating it as a cum circumstantial. So, under the circumstances that Caesar was in nearer Gaul, he learned that the Belgians were conspiring against the Roman people. Okay, I admit it sounds clunky. You could say when Caesar was in nearer Gaul. As you go along, however, you are going to find cum circumstantial clauses that really do benefit from translating cum as under the circumstances that. This one, not so much, but you will see that in other places. So anyway, that was a good practice exercise. Let's take a look at number 2. Cum nox finem oppugnandi fecit, icius nuntium ad Caesarem misit. A similar structure to this sentence. We have a subordinate clause first. That's a cum clause, cum plus the subjunctive. And then we have the main clause after that. So let's look at our main clause. That's icius through misit. The subject here is icius. That's a person's name. So icius is a person. He is doing the action here. Misit is the verb. That's a form of the verb mitto, which means send. Mitto, mittere, misi, missum. So misi is the perfect tense, first person singular. That means I sent. And so misit says he, she, or it sent. Nuntium means basically a messenger. Here they're translating it as message. Second declension nuntius means messenger, as in a person who carries a message. So it could be that noun in the accusative. So it could be icius sent a messenger, or it could be the neuter noun nuntium, which means message. It could be that in the accusative. So it could be, morphologically, nuntium could be nuntius in the accusative or nuntium in the accusative. We don't really know. Here they're treating it as the neuter noun nuntium, which means message. So they're saying Icius sent a nuntium, as in a message, to Caesar. But before that, we have a cum clause with cum plus the subjunctive. So will it be cum circumstantial? Will it be cum causal? Or will it be cum concessive? Will we translate cum as when, since, or although? Or better yet, under the circumstances that, since, or although. Well, in this lesson, they're trying to help us get practice with cum circumstantial clauses. So it's probably going to be a circumstantial clause because that's what they're trying to help us practice right now. So here we have cum. We need to figure out how to translate that. The subject here is nox, which means night. And then we have a pluperfect subjunctive. Fecissent says had made. Okay, it's pluperfect, but because we're in a cum plus the subjunctive clause, it has to be subjunctive. So instead of, cum fecerat in the indicative, we have fecissent, which is pluperfect subjunctive. That's a form of the verb facio, which means to do or make. And so fecissent says had done or had made, and finem is the direct object. That means end. So it says night had made an end, and then opugnandi is a gerund. The verb opugno means to attack. So this gerund here is in the genitive. So we'll translate opugnandi as of attacking. So in the subordinate clause at the beginning, we have night has made an end of attacking. That means that someone's attacking somebody, but as it got dark, they had to stop because they couldn't see anymore. So the battle comes to an end because darkness falls. Okay, so night, in a sense, night has made an end of the attacking. And then Icius sends a message to Caesar. So how will we translate cum? Will this be a cum circumstantial, cum causal, or cum concessive? Just for fun and for learning, let's try it some wrong ways. Let's try it as a cum causal. Let's translate cum as since or because. So since night had made an end of attacking, Icius sent a message to Caesar. That's actually not so bad. It could be that he expected the battle to go on, but it didn't. It got dark, and it surprised him, so he's like, well, I got to tell Caesar about this. So that's possible. Let's try it as a cum concessive. We'll translate cum as although. Although night had made an end of attacking, Icius sent a message to Caesar. That could possibly make sense. We might need more context to make sense of it. Perhaps in some larger context, the circumstances surrounding that might be such that that makes sense. What the authors of the book want us to do here is they want us to practice with cum circumstantial clauses. So in reality, they're treating this as cum circumstantial. So we will translate the word cum here as when, or as I'm advising you to do, under the circumstances that. So we could say, when night had made an end of attacking, Icius sent a message to Caesar. Or, under the circumstances that night had made an end of attacking, Icius sent a message to Caesar. And so what I'm pointing out to you here basically is that the first part of the sentence here, this cum circumstantial clause, it does not necessarily mean time. So when you say cum means when, it makes it sound like Icius is sending the message to Caesar, in a time that's connected with the fact that the battle is over. In other words, when that event occurred, that's temporally when Icius did the sending of the message. What I'm trying to communicate to you is that it's not really about time. It's about that's the background circumstance. Icius doesn't send a message to Caesar in such a way that it's aligned in time with the battle being over. He's doing it under the circumstances that the battle was brought to an end by darkness. So, yes, you could translate it as when. You could say, when night had made an end of attacking. But when you do that, it makes it sound like his sending of the message follows, timing-wise. It follows right on the heels of what happened before. But it's not really like that. It's more about circumstances, not timing. So just for fun, translate cum as under the circumstances that, and it's going to be clunky. It's not going to be a very smooth translation, but it's going to be more accurate meaning-wise. So let's do it like this. Under the circumstances that night had made an end of attacking, Iccius sent a message to Caesar. That really captures more of the connection between the subordinate clause and the main clause. As the name suggests, the clause is called a cum circumstantial. Why? Because it's telling you the circumstances. So if you translate it that way, talking about circumstances, that just makes it a little bit more accurate and clear about what the connection is or what the relationship is between the cum clause and the main clause. The cum clause is not telling you a time scheme. It's telling you, as the name suggests, it's telling you circumstances that surround the action of the main clause. So circumstances that surround the main clause, not the timing of the main clause. That's really what I'm trying to communicate here. One last thing before we go on to the vocabulary. At the bottom of page 139, they mention here what I've been referring to as the cum temporal. That's when you have cum plus the indicative. And so they say here at the bottom, note, cum may be followed by any tense of the indicative to denote time, as in a date only, and not to describe the situation. And they have an example here, illo die, that means that day, but it's in the ablative case, so it's ablative of time when. So illo die says, on that day, and then cum means when. Convenerunt is perfect tense, convenio, to get together or assemble, and helvetii is the subject. So on that day, when the helvetii assembled, of course, the use of it there is actually more like almost like a relative pronoun. But anyway, you get the idea. That's what we call a cum temporal, when cum takes the indicative. That's when it really refers more to time. Okay, let's go on now to our vocabulary for this lesson. That's on the next page, page 140, section 371. First we have impedimentum. That's a neuter noun of the second declension. That means hindrance. And the etymology of this word really has to do with something being on your foot. The im part of the word at the beginning, that's in, the preposition in. And then ped, that part of the word is foot. So it has to do with something being, blocking your foot. That's the etymology of it. And so for that reason, it means hindrance because, if you're tripping over something, if something's blocking your foot, you're tripping and it's a hindrance to you. But the way we'll be using it as we read Caesar is in the plural, it's impedimenta because it's neuter. And so impedimenta means all the baggage that the army takes with them in the sense of carts. They have big carts that they would use to pull all the stuff they need as the army travels along. So that's impedimentum. Next we have mulier. That's a third declension noun that means woman. For those of you who have studied Spanish, you probably know the word mujer in Spanish. The word mujer comes from this Latin word. Next we have adventus. That's a fourth declension noun that means arrival. So the nominative is adventus, and then the genitive singular has a macron over the U at the end, so it's adventus, something like that. And the etymology is ad plus venio, to come to some place in the sense of arrive. And in English, we have the word advent, which you may hear a lot at Christmas time. Some people have an Advent calendar. That's a calendar that is sort of like a countdown to Christmas in the sense of the arrival of Christ. And even sometimes that time of year is referred to as Advent. Next we have magistratus, and that's yet another fourth declension noun. So the genitive singular is magistratus with a macron over the U, and it means magistrate, like a government official. Dubious, dubia, dubium is a first and second declension adjective that means doubtful. This word comes almost directly into English as the word dubious. Next we have kind of a special conjunction, queen, and it can mean different things in different contexts. Here they're saying it means that or but that, and the etymology of this word is it's a combination of qui and then the word ne, N-E. And the qui is like this old, archaic instrumental form of qui. So literally it adds up to something like that not, or something like that. But, combined like this, and then over time it just takes on new meanings. It can mean several things if you see it in a text. Again, here they're saying it means that or but that. But it can also mean things like why not? And then combined with other words, you'll see it in expressions like queen etiam, which means something like and moreover. So it's kind of a weird word that can be translated different ways. Actually, when they say but that, that's actually a pretty good way to render it a lot of the time. So we'll just take that as we come to it. We'll see it in the text, and we'll approach that as we see it, cross that bridge when we come to it. A few verbs now. Maturo, maturare, first conjugation, to hasten. Of course, we have our English word mature. Next, we have pareo, parere, parui, paratum. And they don't mention it here, but this verb actually takes the dative case when it means obey. It can also mean to appear. But in this text we're reading, Caesar's Gallic Wars, I think we're going to see it mean obey. And when that happens, it takes the dative case. The party that's being obeyed is put in the dative. Next we have accedo, accedere, accessi, accessum, which means to approach. You can see that's ad plus cedo, literally to go to someplace. Conscisco, consciscere, conscivi, conscitum, to resolve. And so it doesn't just mean to resolve. It has the idea of appointing or decreeing something. And so along with the word sibi, which is a reflexive pronoun, and then mortem, that's the little idiom that in Latin means to commit suicide. So sibi here is dative, and so that's how you arrange this little idiom. You say conscisco sibi, or if I'm talking about myself, I would say conscisco mihi. I decree to myself, or I ordain for myself death. So conscisco mortem mihi would be I ordain death to myself. So that adds up to basically the idea of committing suicide. And we're going to see that here in the text. Lastly, we have prendo, prendere, prendi, prensum, and that's seize or grasp. Those of you who have studied French probably have studied the verb prendre, which comes directly from this verb. Oh, good. Here's a note about queen. It says, note, the conjunction queen is followed by the subjunctive after negative expressions of doubt or hindrance. And you'll see that if you look down at exercise 4 in the exercises. It says there for number 4, non est dubium queen orgetrix. So what it's saying there is, there's no doubt but that orgetrix blah, blah, blah is going to do something. And then we have consciverit as a subjunctive verb. So that's the kind of thing they're talking about. If you have an expression of doubt, and then you have queen, then you'll have a subjunctive verb after that. Okay, time for our translation exercises in section 372. Go ahead and turn off the recording and do all the exercises. And when you're finished, turn the recording back on, and we'll go over them together. Okay, hopefully by now you've completed your homework. Let's go through these exercises together, starting with number 1. Number 1 says, Caesari cum id nuntiatum esset, maturat ab urbe profacisci. Here we have a main clause and a subordinate clause. The main clause is maturat through profacisci, the second part of the sentence. The first part of the sentence is a subordinate clause, and you'll notice it's a cum clause with a subjunctive verb. So the main part of the sentence is maturat ab urbe profacisci. And so maturat is one of our new verbs for this lesson. It means to hasten. This is third person singular present tense. So maturat says he, she, or it hastens. And we have a complementary infinitive, profacisci. That's the third conjugation verb, profaciscor, which is deponent. So this infinitive here looks passive, but it's not, because profaciscor is deponent. So profacisci is a present tense infinitive that means simply to depart or to set out. So maturat plus profacisci says he hastens to set out, or he hastens to depart. Ab urbe means from the city. When they refer to the city, they mean Rome, of course. So whenever you see that expression, someone doing something to the city, it means Rome. Okay, so he hurries, or he hastens, to depart from the city. Now we have a cum clause, cum, and then we have a compound tense here, nuntiatum esset. That's a pluperfect subjunctive. Notice the perfect passive participle working in tandem with an imperfect subjunctive form of sum. And so this is a pluperfect passive subjunctive. And pluperfect, we use the word had. So we'll say it had been announced. Okay, it's pluperfect, so we say had, and then it's passive, so we say that it was announced. And then id here is a form of id, it's neuter, and so it has sort of the feeling of it. Caesari is dative, so that's to Caesar. So it had been announced to Caesar. Notice that nuntiatum is neuter because id is neuter. And since that's a participle, and participles have gender, the gender has to match the subject of the sentence. So now it's time to figure out if this is a cum circumstantial, cum causal, or cum concessive. If it's a cum circumstantial, we'll translate it as under the circumstances that. If it's cum causal, we'll translate cum as since or because. If it's cum concessive, we'll translate cum as although. So let's try these and see which one works best. Let's try although first and make it a concessive clause. Although it had been announced to Caesar, he hastens to set forth or set out or depart from the city. So that doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because it would seem that the fact that Caesar is getting some kind of message would be connected to the fact that he departs from the city. So the idea of those two things working against each other, that doesn't really make much sense here. So it's probably not a concessive cum clause. What about a causal clause, a cum causal? What if it means because or since? Let's try that. Because it had been announced to Caesar, he hastens to depart from the city, or he is hastening to depart from the city. I suppose in a certain context that could work, that could make sense. So that's not too bad. But I think what they're really going for here is to give us a cum circumstantial. So let's translate cum as under the circumstances that, or perhaps when, if you want to have more of a time-oriented one. So under the circumstances that it had been announced to Caesar, he hastens to depart from the city. That's really what we're looking at here. Is the first part of the sentence is setting up the circumstances against which the main clause is happening. He's hastening to depart under the circumstances of having received this message. It's not so much about time, like when it had been announced to Caesar, like that's the time when he did it. It's really not so much about time. It's more about the circumstances, that those are the circumstances that surround him departing from the city. So it's a clunky way to say it, but really it's best to say under the circumstances that it had been announced to Caesar, he hastens to depart from the city. Moving on to number 2. Haec cum Diviciacus flens a Caesare peterit, Caesar eius dextram manum prendit. Again, we have a main clause and a subordinate clause. The main clause is Caesar eius dextram manum prendit. Prendit is one of our new verbs for this lesson. It's prendo prendere from the third conjugation. And it's third person singular perfect tense, so it means he, she, or it grabbed, seized, or grasped. And the subject is Caesar. The direct object is dextram manum, which means right hand. So it says Caesar seized a right hand. And then eius means of him. Remember that eius is a genitive form of is id. It means of someone. In this case, it's of Diviciacus. So we can translate eius as his. If it said Caesar prendit dextram manum suam, then it would mean that Caesar was grabbing his own hand, like getting one hand and grabbing the other hand with his own hand. So this is a good example of the difference between suus sua suum and eius. Suus sua suum and eius can both be translated into English as his or her or its, but suus sua suum refers back to the subject, meaning belonging to the subject. Eius means that something belongs to somebody else. And that's what we have here, because the hand being seized is someone else's hand. It's Diviciacus's hand. So we have Caesar grasped his right hand, his referring to Diviciacus. So that's the main clause. The subordinate clause is haec cum Diviciacus flens a Caesare peterit. This is a cum clause. We have cum, we have a subjunctive verb. The subject is Diviciacus. He's one of the Gallic aristocrats, sort of a nobleman in one of the Gallic tribes. He's being modified here by flens. That's a present participle that means weeping. And peteret is a form of the verb peto, which means to seek, and this is imperfect subjunctive. So, Diviciacus was seeking, and then flens means weeping. So, Diviciacus, weeping, was seeking. Haec is accusative plural, neuter, and it has the idea of these things. Literally, it just says, Diviciacus, weeping, was seeking these, a Caesare, from Caesar. So if he was seeking these, what's these? What does it mean? It means these things, some kind of demands or requests that have been mentioned earlier and now are just being referred to with a demonstrative pronoun. So we have cum plus the subjunctive here. It's a cum clause. It's going to be either circumstantial, causal, or concessive. So will we translate cum as under the circumstances that, since or because, or although? Which one will it be? Let's figure it out. let's try, just for grins, let's try a concessive translation where we translate cum as although. So although Doukiakos, weeping, was seeking these things from Caesar, Caesar grasped his right hand. I suppose in a certain context that could work. We don't really have much context here. Let's try a causal translation. Because Doukiakos, weeping, was seeking these things from Caesar, Caesar grasped his right hand. I suppose that could work too, but I think the way they want us to translate it, they're sort of nudging us toward translating it here is as a circumstantial, a cum circumstantial clause. So what the authors of the book want us to do is they want us to translate cum as when, and they want us to say, when Doukiakos, weeping, was seeking these things from Caesar, Caesar grasped his right hand. And that's fine, but again, as I've said many times, when you translate it that way, it makes it seem more like these two clauses are connected by time. Like when one thing happened, chronologically, the other thing happened, chronologically in a near time or at the same time or right after that. And that's not really what the cum circumstantial communicates. The cum circumstantial communicates the circumstances that surround the action in the main clause. So it's clunky, but let's go with this. Under the circumstances that Doukiakos, weeping, was seeking these things from Caesar, Caesar grasped his right hand. It could be referring to time. It could be that there's a correlation in time, but really it's more of circumstance in a general sense, not just chronological placement in time. So that's what I'm trying to get across to you. So for these cum circumstantial clauses, you can translate cum as when if you want to. I just think it's more accurate. And actually, I was taught this in graduate school. I was specifically told that it's better to translate a cum circumstantial as under the circumstances that, because it gives you a better, more accurate feel for how the two clauses relate to each other. Moving along to number 3, cum civitas suum ius exequi conaretur multitudinem hominum ex agris magistratus cogerent orgetorix mortuus est. Again, we have a subordinate clause and a main clause. The main clause is orgetorix mortuus est. Mortuus est is one of the new deponent verbs you learned in lesson 44. It means to die. It's morior, mori for the present infinitive. And then mortuus sum is how you put it into the perfect tense. So mortuus est means he, she, or it died. Actually, it's a gendered verb with a masculine participle, so it really can only mean he died. If it were a woman, it would be mortua est. If it were a neuter entity, it would be mortuum est. So the fact that it's mortuus gives away the fact that it's talking about a male subject. Because in a situation like this, the gender of that participle will match the gender of the subject. So the main clause here is orgetorix died. And then we have a really long subordinate clause with really two clauses in it. It's really two subordinate clauses. Okay, it's a cum clause with two subjunctive verbs. It's probably going to be a cum circumstantial. So let's just go ahead and cut to the chase here and translate it as under the circumstances that. So civitas means state, and the verb here in this first clause is conaretur. That's imperfect subjunctive. So the state was trying. That's the verb conor, which means to try. And then we have the idiom ius exequi, to enforce its justice, to enforce its right, or something like that. Ius, by the way, is neuter, so it gets suum as the modifying adjective. So the state was trying to enforce its justice. And then we have multitudinumque. Notice the que ending there at the end of multitudinum. In this particular case, that's actually joining a whole new clause. It's just as if you put et after conaretur. Sometimes you'll see que joining not just two adjacent nouns or some local thing. Here it's really joining two big clauses. The subject here is magistratus. Remember, that's a fourth declension noun. So that is going to be nominative plural. In the fourth declension, you have long U and S as the ending for several cases for, I believe, nominative plural, accusative plural, and also genitive singular. Also nominative singular, but without the macron. Here in context, we have to use the context to figure out whether this is accusative or nominative, because it could be either morphologically. But what it looks like is it's the subject of cogerent, and so magistratus will consider that to be nominative plural. The verb here is cogerent, which is a form of kogo, which means to compel or force someone to do something. It's the verb ago with con prefixed to it, and it just gets smooshed together into kogo instead of con ago. So kogo means to force or compel. Here it's imperfect subjunctive, third person plural. And so magistratus and cogerent together say the magistrates were compelling, or the magistrates were forcing. And now that I think about it, kogo can also mean to gather. And I think that's actually what it means here. So it's not so much that the magistrates were forcing or compelling, it's that they were gathering. And what were they gathering? Multitudinem, that's a multitude. And then hominum is genitive plural, so that means of men. Ex agris means out of the fields, or perhaps out of the countryside, something like that. We'll just say out of the fields. So we have a two-part dependent clause, or subordinate clause, with two complete thoughts in it. And then we have the main clause. So here's how it'll go. And again, this is a cum circumstantial. The authors of the book would like you to translate it as when the state was trying to enforce its justice. What I would argue is that we should translate it as under the circumstances that. Again, when you translate it as when, it makes it sound like the relationship is chronological, but the relationship between the clauses here is more circumstantial, not just about time. So here's how I would like to translate it. Under the circumstances that the state was trying to enforce its justice, and continuing with the idea of under the circumstances, and under the circumstances that the magistrates were gathering up a multitude of men from the fields, Orgetorix died. So it's not that Orgetorix died when those things were happening, although it could have been. It's that he died under those surrounding circumstances. Next is number 4. Non est dubium, quin Orgetorix sibi mortem consciverit. We have a few things to look at here. First, we have queen, which is that special conjunction we were looking at. Then we have the idiom in Latin that means to commit suicide. And then we have non est, which has sort of an impersonal kind of sound to it. Non est dubium means something like, there is no doubt, or without a doubt. So the word dubium could be a noun or an adjective. The word dubium can be a second declension noun that means a doubt. Or it could be an adjective that means doubtful. So it could say, there is not a doubt. Or it could say, it is not doubtful. Either way, the meaning is the same. We'll translate it into English as there is no doubt. And then queen is going to mean something like but that. So there is no doubt but that orgeterix, blah, blah, blah. Consciverit is a form of the verb conscisco, which means to ordain or decree. In the vocabulary, they say resolve. I prefer something like, decree or ordain. It doesn't really matter. What does matter, though, is that this is perfect tense subjunctive. So it looks very much like a future perfect, but it's not future perfect. It's a perfect tense subjunctive. Remember that for a perfect subjunctive, you take the perfect stem, you add eri, and then you add endings. So conscivi would be the first person singular perfect tense. So consciv, C-O-N-S-C-I-V, that's the perfect stem. And then you add eri. So that gives us consciveri. And then we add the personal ending, which is the letter T, for third person singular. So consciverit is perfect tense subjunctive for the verb conscisco. So the idea here is he decreed death to himself. Mortem is accusative singular. And then sibi is a dative, a reflexive dative pronoun. It refers back to orgeterix. So literally, orgeterix decreed death to himself. Orgeterix ordained death to himself. Orgeterix resolved death to himself. That's how the grammar adds up literally. But taken as an idiom, we would simply say Orgeterix committed suicide. So number 4 says, there is no doubt but that Orgeterix committed suicide. Let's move on now to exercise 5. It says, diu cum esset pugnatum impedimentis castrisque nostri potiti sunt. Again, in this exercise, we have a main clause and a subordinate clause. The main clause is impedimentis through the end of the sentence, and then diu through pugnatum is a cum clause, probably a cum circumstantial clause. Let's look at the main clause here. The subject is nostri, and the verb is potiti sunt. Nostri is a substantive. It means our in the sense of our men, our soldiers, our guys, something like that. It's just an adjective, but it's a substantive, so it's talking about some group of people. Interestingly, ancient Roman grammarians don't really make a strong distinction between adjectives and nouns. For example, if you read a work called the Ars Minor by Donatus, an ancient grammarian, the Ars Minor is just a quick overview of Latin grammar. And in that overview of Latin grammar, Donatus groups adjectives and nouns under the same heading. He just calls them all nomen, which we translate as name. So for Donatus, adjectives and nouns are the same. And so we see that here with nostri. We call this a substantive, like only the strong survive. The strong what? The strong people, strong animals? It's just an adjective. So you have to supply your own idea of what it's talking about. So that's what a substantive is. We do it in English, some, but not as much as in Latin. And so in Latin, they do it so much that the grammarians grouped adjectives in with nouns. And you can read more about that in the Ars Minor if you choose to look at that. So for an ancient Roman, this substantive here, this nostri, would just be perfectly normal. There's nothing strange at all about it for an ancient Roman. It just means our people, our soldiers, our men, and they would think nothing of it. There's no strangeness at all in that for an ancient Roman. So nostri is the subject. It means our men, our guys, our soldiers. And then we have a perfect tense deponent verb, potiti sunt. That's a form of the verb potior, which means to take possession of. It's one of the 5 special deponent verbs that takes the ablative case. So our guys, our men, our soldiers took possession of. That's the main action occurring here. And so now we need to look around and try to find something in the ablative case that they took possession of. And lo and behold, we have impedimentis and castris. Impedimentis, well, that's the noun impedimentum, which is one of our new words for this lesson. It means something that blocks you or slows you down, like we get the English word impediment from it. But in the plural, it means baggage train, like the carts and wagons that the army would pull along with them, with all their supplies, all their stuff. So that's what it is here. It's referring to all the baggage of the army. And castris, you've known that word for a long time. That means camp. It's in the plural. Castra in the plural means camp. And here it's ablative plural. So the idea here is that our soldiers took possession of the baggage and the camp. Both of those plural nouns, impedimentis and castris, we'll just translate those into English as singulars. So our soldiers took possession of the baggage and the camp. Now let's look at the subordinate clause, diu cum esset pugnatum. So we have esset and pugnatum working together, forming a compound tense. The verb here is pugno, which means to fight. Pugno, pugnare, pugnavi, pugnatum. It's from the first conjugation. And so what do we have here? We have pugnatum, which is the 4th principal part of the verb pugno. Okay, the 4th principal part is variously described. Some textbooks call it the perfect passive participle, others call it the supine. It doesn't really matter because morphologically it's the same. The supine looks just like the perfect passive participle in the neuter gender. When I was in high school, the textbook we used always listed the 4th principal part with a US ending as if to be the perfect passive participle, but other textbooks give you the 4th principal part with UM at the end, and it's the supine. Does it matter? No, you just have to be aware of what's going on. And we have a footnote here. Take a look at the footnote for pugnatum, footnote 3. It says, esset pugnatum, fighting had gone on. This is what we call an impersonal use of a verb. Pugnatum is passive, and also notice that it's neuter in gender. And the neuterness of it is important. That's part of what makes it impersonal. What it's really saying here, esset and pugnatum, what it's really saying is it had been fought. There's no subject here. There's no explicitly stated subject like bellum. Bellum esset pugnatum. A war had been fought. There is no subject such as bellum. The idea is that the subject of the sentence is it. The idea is it had been fought. What had been fought? Well, that's the thing that makes it impersonal, is there is no thing that was fought. It's just a general statement of that fighting occurred, or as they say in the footnote, fighting had gone on. Okay, so literally it's saying it had been fought, but colloquially in our translation, we'll render it into English as something like there had been fighting going on, or there had been fighting. It's just like in English, if I said something like, there was fighting going on over at the bowling alley. You're not saying who did it. You're just saying that there was fighting that was occurring. So that's exactly what's happening here with esset pugnatum. It's an impersonal saying that there was fighting going on. It's really in the pluperfect, pugnatum esset. So we throw in the word had and we say fighting had gone on. du means for a long time. And then cum, the authors of the book would like us to translate that as when. I'm trying to nudge you more toward translating it as under the circumstances that. Let's do our little exercise again where we try the different translations for the cum clause. I think that's educational. Again, when you have cum plus the subjunctive, it can be a cum circumstantial, in which you translate cum as under the circumstances that, or it could be a cum causal clause, in which you translate cum as since or because, or it could be a cum concessive clause, in which you translate cum as although. So those are the three choices. Let's try them just for fun. Let's try although first. It's probably wrong, but that's okay. We're just practicing here and learning. So in that case, it would read something like, although there had been fighting going on for a long time, our soldiers took possession of the baggage and the camp. That doesn't make much sense because when you use although, it suggests that the two clauses in the sentence are somehow opposed to each other. That even though this happened, that other thing happened anyway, even though you wouldn't think it would happen. But that's not what's going on here. The two parts of the sentence, the two clauses, the dependent clause and the main clause, they're not really in conflict with each other like that. So to make it a concessive clause and use although, that doesn't really communicate the meaning very well. So it's not a cum concessive clause. So let's try causal. What if cum here means since or because? Okay, let's try it. Because there had been fighting for a long time, our soldiers took possession of the baggage and the camp. Still not all that great. It could possibly be correct under some context, but it doesn't really seem to have that ring of clarity to it. Now let's try a cum circumstantial. Under the circumstances that there had been fighting going on for a long time, our soldiers took possession of the baggage and the camp. I think that's what the authors of the book are guiding us toward, although they would like us to translate it as when. Let's try it that way just for fun. When fighting had gone on for a long time, our soldiers took possession of the baggage and the camp. There's really nothing wrong with that. It works fine. It's just not quite as good as under the circumstances that, because as I say every time, it makes it sound like the relationship between the subordinate clause and the main clause is mainly one of time reference. But it's really not just about time. There could be a time relationship, but really, as the name circumstantial suggests, the relationship is really one of circumstances. The idea that the information in the subordinate clause tells you the circumstances under which, or the background circumstances against which, the main clause takes place. So our final translation for number 5, under the circumstances that fighting had gone on for a long time, our soldiers took possession of the baggage and the camp. Number 6 is next. Cum Caesar ad oppidum accessit, castraque ibi poneret, pueri mulieresque pacem ab Romanis petierunt. Here we have, yet again, a subordinate clause and then a main clause. The subordinate clause is a cum clause. It's actually got two clauses in there, two verbs, accessit and poneret. And then our main clause is pueri through petierunt. Let's look at the main clause first, just to see what the main action is. Pueri means boys. Notice I'm putting the accent on the first syllable. It's not pueri, because that E is not long, and it's not in a closed syllable. So it's pueri. Pueri says boys, and then mulieres is women. That's one of our new nouns for this lesson. Mulieres has the que ending, so pueri mulieresque says boys and women. And the verb is petierunt. That's the verb peto, which can mean several things. It can mean to seek. I think it can mean to ask for. It can mean to head for a certain place, as in to, travel to a place. Here it just means to seek. And pacem is the direct object. That means peace. Pax, pacus, from the third declension. So we have the boys and the women sought peace ab Romanis, from the Romans. So not too difficult there. Notice the footnote next to petierunt. That is a syncopated form of that perfect tense verb. With its full spelling, it would be petiverunt, Petiverunt. Here it looks like the V has slipped out of there, and you have just petierunt. Also, sometimes you might see this verb without the nt. You might just see petiere. So there are a couple of different ways to syncopate that verb form, and not just for that verb, but for lots of perfect tense verbs. Especially if you read poetry, if you read Virgil, as in the epic poem known as the Aeneid, you'll see lots of perfect tense forms with some of the ends chopped off. Sometimes they call those Virgilian perfects. The way it was explained to me is that the word syncopated is used when there's something chopped out of the inside part of the word. When some inner letters get thrown out, you call that a syncopation. But when the end is chopped off, as in petiere, that's not called syncopation. I've heard that in other languages called an apocopated verb. That's a Greek word. Apo means from, and cop, C-O-P, that root word means to cut. So to apocopate something means to chop off something. So if you have an apocopated verb, it's a verb that is got something at the end chopped off. And that's what you see in Virgil. They don't really call it apocopated. They call it just Virgilian perfects, because he did that so often. But here in Caesar, this is prose, not poetry. And so what we have is petiverunt, but with the V omitted. So it's petierunt. And that's what they want you to notice here by looking at footnote 4. If you want, you can go back to page 95 to section 265, and you can review that information. Here they're calling it contraction, not syncopation. Okay, so the main clause is the boys and women sought, that's the perfect tense, they sought peace from the Romans. Now let's look at the cum clause with cum plus the subjunctive and see what that is saying. Probably it's going to be a cum circumstantial, because that's what the authors of the book have been trying to get us to practice. Probably they'll want us to translate cum as when, and probably I'll try to convince you to translate it as under the circumstances that. So let's take a look at the subordinate clause, the cum clause, that is. It's really two clauses in one. We have two verbs, akasiset and poneret. Notice that akasiset is pluperfect subjunctive, while poneret is imperfect subjunctive. So let's just go ahead and translate cum here as under the circumstances that. And then akasiset means advance or approach. And then ad oppidum means to the town. So under the circumstances that Caesar had advanced to the town, again, akasiset is pluperfect, so it's had advanced. And then we have poneret, that's imperfect subjunctive. So he was pitching the camp. When you have pono ponere is a verb that means to put or place. Along with the word castra for camp, it means to pitch camp, to set up the camp. And ibi means there. So under the circumstances that Caesar had advanced to the town and was pitching camp there, the boys and women sought peace from the Romans. So again, that first part of the sentence, cum through poneret, is telling us the circumstances under which the rest of the sentence happens. The pueri through the end is the main clause. The cum clause tells us the circumstances or background against which the activity of the main clause takes place. And notice again, in telling us about those background circumstances, akesiset is pluperfect. It's showing us that some kind of action already had been completed in the past. We use the word had in English to translate that. Caesar had approached toward the town or had advanced toward the town. But with poneret, it's imperfect subjunctive. So it's like continuous action. It's like he was setting up the camp. So the circumstances being talked about here are circumstances in which he had already completed the activity of advancing toward the town. That had already been done, pluperfect tense. But then he was setting up the camp. He was pitching camp. So the use of the imperfect there makes it feel to me like that activity was ongoing at some point, almost as if while the camp is being set up, that's when the boys and women come in and they start asking for things. So in this particular example, translating cum as when isn't so bad because it does have sort of a chronological feeling to it. It's telling you when things happened chronologically. So, you could translate cum here as when. Still, I prefer under the circumstances that. So, number 6 says, under the circumstances that Caesar had advanced toward the town and was setting up camp or was pitching camp there, the boys and women sought peace from the Romans. And I think that the word pueri, meaning boys, I think it can also just mean children in general. So what it could be saying here is the women and children sought peace. I think that's kind of what it's saying. Number 7 is next. Cum helvetii eum in itinere conveniscent et flintes pacem petissent atque Caesar eos suum adventum expectare iussisset paruerunt. In this particular sentence, it's 90% a cum clause and then just one word for the main clause. The main clause is just paruerunt, but then the rest of the sentence is packed with subjunctive verbs telling us circumstances. So it's when this had happened and when that had happened and then that had happened, finally paruerunt. Okay, so that's the structure of it. Paruerunt is a form of the verb pareo. That's actually one of our new verbs for this lesson. Pareo, parere, parui, paritum. Here it's going to mean obey, and the party that you obey with the verb pareo gets put into the dative case. So paruerunt says they obeyed. That's the main clause. That's all we get for the main clause. Now let's look at all the subordinate clauses, the cum clauses that tell us the circumstances or background against which the activity of the main clause happens. Conveniscent is a form of the verb convenio, which literally means to come together. There's a footnote here. It says convenio, when used with an object, means meet. Conveniscent is pluperfect subjunctive, so we'll use the word had in English to translate it. Just for the sake of convenience, let's translate cum as when, just because it's shorter to say. So when the helvetii had met him, eum is a form of is id, and that's the person they're meeting, it's him. In itinere means on the way or while traveling or en route, something like that. We'll just translate it as on the way. So when the helvetii had met him on the way, and flintes petissent, we've seen all that before, weeping, flintes is a present tense participle, modifying the Helvetii. So, weeping, they sought peace. Pacem petissent. Actually, petissent is also pluperfect subjunctive. We've had a V and an I chopped out of that. It really would be petiviscent. If you really want to see all the different permutations of this verb, a great place to look, I use it all the time, is Wiktionary. It's Wikipedia's dictionary section or dictionary arm. So it's wiktionary.org. You can just type in Latin peto, and it'll bring up the entry for peto. And it has a full paradigm of all the charts, really high quality paradigms. And they list all the variant forms. So if you really want to look at all the variant forms, go to Wiktionary, and you'll see for the pluperfect subjunctive, you'll see petiviscent, petiissent, with two I's, and petissent. And that's what we have here is petissent, or long I, petissent. Anyway, it's pluperfect subjunctive, so it means they had sought, and then pacem is peace. So when the Helvetii had met him on the way, and weeping, they had sought peace, and now we have even more things here in this subordinate clause telling us the circumstances. So yet another clause coming up, Caesar iussisset. That's a form of the verb eubeo, which means to command. The four principal parts are eubeo, eubere, iussi, iussum, from the second conjugation. So iussisset is pluperfect subjunctive, third person singular. So it's he had commanded, but it's in the subjunctive. So pluperfect subjunctive. And now we have an accusative plus infinitive construction here within this clause. Eos is the accusative subject. Expectare is the infinitive verb. I suppose you could treat it as indirect speech. It's similar to that construction. I don't know if you would technically classify this as indirect speech. He's really issuing a command. Either way, it still has the same accusative plus infinitive construction. He had commanded eos, which means them, referring to the Helvetii, expectare, to wait for. And then suum adventum is his arrival. Adventum is one of our new words for this lesson. Suum means his, her, or its, referring back to the subject of the sentence. So here it means his in the sense of Caesar's, because he's the subject of the sentence. So he had commanded them, expectare, to wait for his arrival. Okay, so the sentence is, when this had happened, when that had happened, and when this other thing had happened, they obeyed. That's the structure of it. So let's take it from the top. When the Helvetii had met him on the way, and weeping had sought peace, and when Caesar had ordered them to wait for his arrival, they obeyed. You know, expectare can mean to expect, but a lot of times it just means to wait for something. It's really the verb specto, which means to watch, and then ex means out. So you're watching outwardly, outwardly for something to happen. And as you do that, you're waiting for something to happen. So you could interpret that as expecting it or waiting for it. Okay, next we have number 8. Magistratus eos hurtatur ut populi Romani amicitiam sequantur. The main clause here is magistratus esse hurtatur, and then we have a result clause starting with ut. Hortatur is one of our fairly new deponent verbs. It means to encourage. That's a hortor, hortari, hortatus sum. And so here it's just a present tense indicative verb. So this is a first conjugation deponent verb. So here we just have a simple present tense third person singular. The subject is magistrate, and then the verb is hortatur. He, she, or it is encouraging. So the magistrate is encouraging, and then eos is the direct object. That's a form of is ea id in the accusative plural. So the magistrate is encouraging them, and then ut, starting there, it's going to tell us what exactly he's encouraging them to do. So the magistrate is encouraging them that they blah, blah, blah. We talked about this kind of thing in the last lesson. This is called an indirect command. So ut plus the subjunctive, we have sequantur, that's a form of sequor, which means follow. If it were indicative, it would be secuntur, but with the a there, it's subjunctive present tense. So sequantur says they follow, but it's in the subjunctive. So the magistrate is encouraging them that they follow the amicitiam, that is the friendship, populi Romani, of the Roman people. So the magistrate is encouraging them that they follow the friendship of the Roman people. I think follow here might not be the best translation. Another translation you can use for sequor is pursue. So I think what's happening here is the magistrate is encouraging them that they pursue friendship with the Roman people. But it's worded like this, that they pursue the friendship of the Roman people. This time in history for the ancient Romans was probably one of the most blatantly imperialistic periods in their history. They were just blatantly, conquering territory. They tried to keep it on the surface as if they were doing it for legitimate reasons. They were trying to portray it as self-defense, portraying it as defending their territorial rights. Another big thing they tried to do is make it look like they were doing it to support their allies. But underneath it all is just this blatant territorial expansion. They just wanted to control the territories around them. Julius Caesar wanted to get fame and fortune by going into Gaul and conquering it, taking control of it. It's just straight territorial expansion. And so the Romans are just using every trick in the book to get the different tribes to go along with what they want, to, respect their wishes. And so number 8 is just an exercise, but it does fit very well into the general context of history. We can word this in a little bit smoother English like this. We could say, the magistrate is encouraging them to pursue friendship of the Roman people. That's not as literal, but that's a nice smooth way to put it into English. Number 9 consists only of one word. It's just an exercise for practice. Parere is the infinitive form of pareo, which means to obey. So it just simply means to obey. If it were parare, then it would be the verb paro from the first conjugation, which means to prepare. So parare, to prepare, parere, to obey. Number 10 is akedins. Here they want us to practice, apparently, with participles. That's a present tense participle. It's active. It's from the verb akedo, which means to advance or approach. So it's nominative singular, and it means advancing or approaching. Nice review there of present participles, present active participles, that is. Number 11, maturando. That is a gerund, and it's a form of one of our new verbs for this lesson, maturo. That's a first conjugation verb that means to hasten. So maturando could be in the ablative case, and it could be saying by means of hastening. Technically, it could be dative. It could be for hastening, but probably it's not. Probably it's just an ablative saying something like by hastening or by means of hastening. Again, that's a gerund, not a gerundive. A gerundive would most likely have a noun along with it. A gerundive really is an adjective. But here, it's just a gerund, which is just a verbal noun. And you can go back and review that if you need to. Number 12, incitandi plebis causa. Here we have an actual gerundive. So that's a nice review here in 11 and 12. Nice review of gerunds and gerundives. Whereas a gerund is a verbal noun, a gerundive is a future passive participle that functions really to modify a noun. They call participles, in Latin, they call them verbal adjectives. They're adjectives that decline like adjectives, but at their heart, the heart of their meaning is really the action of a verb. And so here, incitandi is a gerundive. It's modifying plebis. So the verb incito is first conjugation. Incito, incitare, incitavi, incitatum. It means to set in motion, to stir up, to rouse, to incite, to egg on. And that's what it's doing here. It's to incite or stir up. And then it's modifying plebis, which is the common class of people in Rome, the plebs. Incitandi and plebis both are in the genitive singular. Why? Because causa, the word causa means reason or cause. Here it's in the ablative case. So it has the idea of for the reason of, for the sake of, for the cause of. So causa, for the cause, and then of the plebs to be stirred up. That's literally what's happening. You know, why did he give such a incendiary speech? Incitandi plebis causa, for the sake of the plebs to be stirred up. Now, when we say in English, for the plebs to be stirred up, that doesn't really say a whole lot. It's clunky English. So what we do is we take the passive verb that is incitandi, to be stirred up, and we mess with it a little bit. We make it active. And then plebis, we turn that into the direct object of incitandi. So we translate phrases like this in a non-literal way to make them smoother English. In Latin, this is perfectly normal syntax. This is just the normal way they would say it. But when we translate it word for word, it makes weird-sounding English. So we put it into a non-literal translation that makes it sound nice and smooth in English. So literally, it says, for the cause of the plebs to be stirred up. But to make it sound like smooth English, we say, for the cause of stirring up the plebs. We flip around the wording a little bit. We make passive active and just mess with it a little bit to make it smoother sounding English. So it's for the sake of stirring up the plebs or something like that. Okay, so that was a good review in 9, 10, 11, and 12. Good review of infinitives, present active participles, gerunds, and gerundives. It's nice to review some of that stuff. And so that's it for this lesson. Thank you for listening. Don't forget to try to speak Latin. Try all this stuff you're learning. Try to figure out ways to say things in Latin in such a way that you use some of these grammatical elements. Try to say them and just repeat them. Do whatever it takes to just say the Latin. If you have friends and you can speak Latin with them and practice this stuff, that's great. If you have a study partner, a study buddy, that's great. If you have a private teacher, that would be great too. But even if you don't have all that stuff, you can still do it by yourself. You can do narration where you just talk to your cat, talk to your dog. I personally talk to myself in the car as I'm driving down the road. I do a lot of narration like that. If I'm trying to memorize something, or if I'm trying to learn some new words, I'll talk to myself like that. So narration is a perfectly normal way to practice. My point here is narration, just saying the words, for practice is a really good way to help yourself absorb all the grammatical elements, syntactical things, vocabulary things, endings, verb forms, syncopations. It's a lot to know. It's a lot to learn. So if you treat it as a natural language and just try to say things over and over, it's only going to help you. So speak Latin as much as you can while you're learning all this grammar translation stuff. This is a straight grammar, traditional Latin grammar class. But that doesn't stop you from using spoken Latin methods to help yourself study. So as you go along, study all the stuff, but then try to, turn it into actual spoken language. And that's going to be a huge study aid for you. It'll be extremely helpful and help you to learn the language faster and better. And if possible, try to go online and join a Latin chat group or find someone to talk to where you can really practice speaking Latin. And that's going to pay huge dividends for you as you learn this language. Okay, great. That's it for this lesson. We'll see you next time in lesson 47.